In the previous episode, I considered what life experienced via our smartphone screens was like. I suggested that this could be very joyful. Our smartphones let us live amongst the flows. This is the fantasy of weightlessness, of absolute mobility, of being able to exist in any time and space. I suggested this was problematic, however, since the joy of living amongst the flows obscures the ways that the smartphone integrates us more and more into capitalism. Of course, however, we do not simply live amongst the flows today. We are at the same time embodied beings existing in a particular time and place. The question I want to ask in this video then is, how does our phone change our relationship with the material environments, the non-mediated world, or what some would call the real world? Let's consider a very everyday scene. Here's Tom drinking coffee in a busy cafe. He's not having a very good time. Whilst the coffee's okay, the people around him are not. There's a businessman who's bawling at his colleague on the phone, compensating for his inadequacies through the volume of his voice. There's a couple on a first date. While their terrible attempts at flirting are entertaining, they're also making Tom feel quite awkward. There's a man in the corner looking shifty. Tom decides to keep a close eye on his possessions just in case this man decides to take them. Even the environment isn't helping much. It's trying to be quirky and personal, but Tom's been in 1,000 cafes like this. It's off-puttingly generic. So what does Tom do to improve his mood? He starts playing with his phone, of course. He starts by messaging his girlfriend. However, even this isn't enough to keep the world out, so he puts his headphones on and starts streaming cat videos. He's now in a blissful Tom space that instantly elevates his mood. He's made the coffee shop bearable precisely through erasing it from his experience. This seems like a perfectly normal and reasonable response to a scenario typical of modern life. However, I want to argue precisely the opposite. In fact, it embodies some of the major problems of smartphone capitalism. If this seems absurd, let me try to convince you. Let's start by observing that there are two worlds described in Tom's narrative. The first is the real world, and the second is the world of Tom. Tom uses his phone to create the world of Tom when he doesn't want to face the real world of the coffee shop. Now, I've described this process in the very specific context of Tom in the coffee shop, but it's fair to say that it occurs multiple times throughout the average day of any smartphone user. In my interviews with smartphone users, one of the big themes was the bleakness of modern life. Modern life is seen as a battle for survival, surviving work, surviving the city, surviving the sheer pace of life. An average day is characterized by loneliness, anxiety, and boredom. So how do people address this bleakness? Well, they turn to their phones. The smartphone is a world of loved ones, of play and entertainment, of being special. Emotionally, it's characterized by joy, warmth, care, and authenticity. Let's call these two worlds alienated reality and the utopia of me. The genius of the smartphone is that it allows us to escape into the utopia of me in any time and place. Whilst this argument should be clear and uncontroversial, it does pose many important questions. Chief among them is what's so wrong with the world that we constantly have to seek refuge in our phones. To understand this, we should consider the concept of alienation. According to Rahul Yegi, alienation is a relation of relationlessness. It's a sense of existing in a void, being cut adrift from the things in life that provide meaning, like other people, nature, work, even God. The result is that our life lacks authenticity. The concept has existed throughout history, but it's particularly associated with the capitalist age. Indeed, many of the great thinkers of capitalism have utilized it. For instance, Marx argued that the capitalist mode of production alienated the worker from his human potential. Max Weber focused on bureaucracy. He described it as an iron cage that introduces the polar night of icy darkness. 20th century thinkers focused on the alienating effects of mass consumption. For example, Mark Hughes argued that advertising created false needs and the figure of one-dimensional man. Guy Debord argued that people have become drugged and seduced by the society of the spectacle. The city is also alienating. Observing turn-of-the-century Berlin, Jörg Simmel suggested that the city dweller becomes saturated by the endless procession of sounds, images, and people. The result is that he or she adopts the blasé attitude, a numbness and indifference caused by the inability to take in any more stimuli. So that was the alienation in the 19th and 20th centuries. But how relevant is it today in the world of frictionless flows? Alienation as an intellectual theme has really gone out of fashion since the 1970s. One reason for this is that alienation is seen as an effect of mass society. However, we don't think of the mass so much anymore. Things seem much more individualistic. So why am I using alienation here? Well, I do actually think it's very relevant to understanding the dynamics of smartphones. I want to argue that the world of frictionless flows is profoundly alienating. To recap from the previous episode, the world of frictionless flows is a super streamlined, efficient capitalism. It's a world whose chief value is mobility of people, of finance, of knowledge. It values the dynamic over the stable, the global over the local, and the fluid over the static. Certainly, this world can be exciting. It's a world of constant change, weightlessness, and mobility. I explored in the last video how our phones allowed us to experience these things. Yet I also think that in other ways, the world of frictionless flows is alienating and meaningless. I think there are three main reasons for this: dehumanizing flows, privatized homogenization, and hostile hyper-individualism. These are what I'd call the three alienations of frictionless flows. Let's start with dehumanizing flows. One of the consequences of life governed by frictionless flows is that life becomes increasingly abstract. A few decades ago, the forces that govern society seemed relatively easy to understand. They were things like the state or the corporation. Such institutions could be quite dominant, but we also had avenues for resisting them. For example, the polling booth or the picket line. This isn't the case anymore. Today, we seem beholden to mysterious forces that we don't really understand. One important example is finance. Since the 1980s, Western economies have become financialized. In other words, the financial sector has replaced traditional industries, and economic life is increasingly governed by finance. We only need to think back to 2007 and the global financial crash to see how important finance has become to life. And yet, it is fundamentally an abstract thing. It exists predominantly not as something tangible like dollar bills, but as data. Furthermore, in an era of financialization, measures that don't seem to relate to anything real, like stock market indexes and exchange rates, become increasingly important. We see instead a world that is increasingly remote from us. Perhaps this is why the folk demon of our day is the expert. He or she speaks this language of abstraction, a language that seems to have no relevance to everyday life. And we see a world over which we have less control, with democracy increasingly ineffective. Finally, we see a world that seems fundamentally unjust. It seems that no matter what we do, the 99% of us are destined to get poorer as the 1% get richer. So I'm suggesting that dehumanizing flows are associated with a general feeling of being alienated from the forces that constitute our world. That is, a sense that we do not make the world and it does not exist for us. If this form of alienation seems rather opaque, let's consider two others that are more tangible. First, privatized homogeneity, which relates specifically to the city. The world is becoming increasingly homogenized. All cities increasingly look the same. We increasingly live in what Marc Augé calls the non-space, places like malls and airports that could exist anywhere, with seemingly no link to their geographic location. Of course, we've seen the rise of spaces that react against this by being more authentic. But ironically, even they all end up being the same too. the hipster coffee shop with its exposed brickwork and bearded baristas who are also DJs is found from Delhi to Detroit. Homogenization is a long-standing process, but since the 1970s it's been joined by another process, privatization. The cities we live in are increasingly owned by companies and rich individuals. The result is that more and more spaces are becoming out of bounds to the populace. I think that the combination of these two processes creates a fundamental transformation in our relationship with the city. In the past, we may have viewed it as a place for us to live in. Now we view it as a dehumanizing place for finance to thrive in. The last alienation is hostile hyper-individualism. This relates specifically to our relations with others. One of the most cherished values of contemporary capitalism is competition. Competition between firms, but also between people. Today, as Michel Foucault puts it, we must be entrepreneurs of ourselves. This means constantly building our own personal capital through activities like acquiring skills and networking. The benefit of this is that we gain competitive advantage, whether in work, love, or any other area of life. The problem, though, is that we become deeply alienated from other people. Other people do not exist for us as a source of mutually meaningful and perhaps even spiritual encounters. Instead, they are there to be beaten in the field of competition. Or, if we do engage with them, it's only so that we may extract useful knowledge or opportunities from them. Furthermore, this emphasis on competition creates a general anxiety that people are out to cheat or hurt us. One of the fundamental rules of this culture of competition is always follow your self-interest. Thus, logically, some people's self-interest may be best served by actions that harm us in some way. It's therefore in our self-interest to treat others generally with the utmost suspicion. So, in summary, with hostile hyper-individualism, we are alienated from other people. With homogenized privatization, we are alienated from the city. And with dehumanizing flows, we're alienated from the world at large. Between them, they create a general malaise of meaninglessness. So how does the phone address these alienations? In the case of dehumanizing flows, it rehumanizes experience. Dehumanizing flows enslave us to forces that make life abstract and fragmented. The genius of the smartphone is to allow us to spontaneously create a world that provides a sense of immediacy, authenticity, and feeling centered, even though it's mediated. There are many ways the smartphone can do this, but perhaps the most powerful of all is simply receiving a message from a loved one. For many people in my research, such messages provided the uplift they needed to survive the world of dehumanizing flows a bit longer. This need for comfort becomes greater as we move around the city. That's because of privatized homogeneity and hostile hyper-individualism. The phone allows us to form a mobile bubble around ourselves as we move about. This is an idea that has been explored in relation to Walkmans and iPods by Michael Bull. Bull argues that these devices allow us to heighten our experience through playing the music we love. In turn, we can colonize the city. We experience impersonal spaces as somehow our own. The city moves to our rhythm, not the other way round. The smartphone, of course, retains such abilities, but it also adds new ones. For instance, video streaming. Cassetti and San Pietro argue that watching videos on your phone creates your very own mobile cinema that blocks out the intrusions of others. You might be experiencing this right now. Another good example is augmented reality. AR has become popular recently due to the extraordinary success of Pokemon Go. The significance of AR is the fantastical transformation of the city that it makes possible. With AR, the city is no longer grey, hostile and alienating. Instead, it's a bright, playful wonderland, an enchanted garden of mysteries and delights. So our phones are magical boxes that counter the alienation of the world through allowing us to create the utopia of me in countless different ways. It would seem that in this regard, our phones play a really positive role. They convert a meaningless world into something meaningful. Yet, I want to reject this conclusion. Actually, our phones reinforce the alienation of contemporary life. Basically, the logic of the smartphone is that I'm unable to face the world, so I have to run away from it. There's something childish about this. In psychoanalysis, the separation from the mother is considered a very traumatic event. Therefore, the child may embrace a variety of ersatz objects that provide maternal comfort. Literally, this could be a comfort blanket. Yet, learning to live without comfort blankets is essential to becoming a healthy adult. However, here we are, children and adults alike, embracing the ultimate comfort blanket. Not only is it childish, but it's fatalistic and defeatist as well. The implicit logic we rely upon is, the world is alienating, but there is nothing we can do about it. So the best we can hope for is to make life a bit more manageable through temporary escape. This is totally the wrong logic. Our decision is basically to be passive and not to challenge the world of frictionless flows. And furthermore, the smartphone makes it even less likely for a critical consciousness to emerge. We're now all going around in our little hermetically sealed bubbles, becoming ever more isolated from each other. Challenging the status quo requires protest and resistance, things that can only come about through working collectively. How can we possibly do that when our behaviour drives us even further away from collective interaction? The solution is clear. We need to burst our bubbles and start working together. Unfortunately, this is something that seems further away than ever.